every time I read this passage of the gospel, I really smile when the scribe says to Jesus, "Well said, teacher. You're right in saying." And I think the Lord is saying, does he have any idea who he's talking to? Like, I'm God. So he's kind of giving God a high five. You're really doing it well. So years ago, Cardinal George, of beloved memory, made a comment that most priests have 5 or 6 homilies. That's about it. And everything is a variation on that theme. And they've got 2, maybe 3 books. And so today is a variation on a theme that I've spoken about a lot before, which is the first commandment. What is the first commandment? Why were they even asking what's the first of all commandments? Because at that time, in the practice of Jewish religion, there were many commandments. Fasting laws and eating laws and traveling laws and not doing anything on the Sabbath. There's so many things going on, like talking about all sorts of stuff. Many times they get lost in the weeds. Okay, like what's the most important? Oh yeah, the first commandment that God gave to Moses. And that is, you shall love the Lord your God above all things. And back in the 50s, when they were doing this movie in Technicolor with Charlton Heston called The 10 Commandments, and Charlton Heston was portraying Moses. Somebody came up to the director of the movie on the set and said, "What do you think was the hardest commandment for the Israelites to keep?" He said, "Well, that's simple. It was the first one." "Really? Did they have like false idols and the rest?" He said, "Well, they kept going back to that way. Remember when they were in the desert and Moses went up the mountain for 40 days and he came back and they were worshiping that golden calf?" Well, that should be a warning for us that we too have to fight and make an effort to put God in the first place and give him the most. And sacrifice is an act of religion. Every religion makes sacrifices. And I would suggest that whatever we make the most sacrifices for becomes our God. So if we make the most sacrifices for Jesus, he's our God. But sometimes people make a lot of sacrifices for wealth. Everything's for that. And so they don't go to church on Sunday or any other day of the year. Or they make a sacrifice for their profession. They have no time for God. Or they make all sorts of sacrifices for their appearance and how they look, but they don't have time for others. Or they make all sorts of sacrifices for their health. I remember years ago giving this talk to some of the students at Northridge Prep, and one young man, he's married now with several kids, he said, "What if you make most of your sacrifices for your family? Has your family become a false god?" And I said, "That's a good question. I know there are people who've left their families and traveled halfway around the world to serve God. That was the case of St. Damon and Malachi. These days, with WhatsApp and the internet, you can always stay in touch with your family, right?" But it was a good question. So reflecting on this more, I said, the answer here is, and the second one is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So if you're making sacrifices for your family, you're making sacrifices for others, you're actually really doing that for God. It's the other side of the coin. So we are called to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and all our strength. And there's a number of saints that I think really do this in a fine way. When we think of loving God with all your heart, I think of the 2 visionaries at Fatima, Francisco and Jacinta, and how they generously responded to Our Lady's call to pray and do penance. Sometime after that miracle of the sun in November of 1917, some women in the village or visitors, they came upon Francisco, and he was, 9 or 10 years old, and said, "Francisco, what do you want to be when you grow up? Do you want to be a doctor? You want to be a priest? What do you want to be?" He said, "I don't want to be anything. I just want to be with God." It was a beautiful thing. God took him some months later with the flu of that time. So he loved God with all his heart. With all your soul, that's St. Maria Goretti. Remember her story? She was between a rock and hard place, a farmhouse. An older guy tried to corner her, and she said quite energetically, "No, it's a sin." She was raised very well by her parents. She loved the Lord with all her soul. How about loving God with all your mind? That's clearly St. Thomas Aquinas. How about loving God with all your strength? One example of that is St. Juan Diego, who walked 15 miles to go to church on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and on his way, he encountered Our Lady of Guadalupe. So let's ask God for the grace for each one of us in our own way to love the Lord our God with all our mind, all our heart, all our soul, and all our strength.